You're watching Ceasefire today with Hannah Riaz, Ruqayya Sarami and the wonderful author Kiese Laymon. Today we'll be talking to Kiese about a range of things, including his novel Long Division, his essays and a host of other subjects. So Kiese, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. We're like super stoked. And we thought we'd kind of introduce this with what we thought was like the central theme or what grabbed us the most, which was language and your use of language. Yeah. And looking and reading the book, we kind of felt that you kind of demonstrated how language can be used as a tool of resistance, but also as a tool of affirmation. So we kind of want to know, what does language mean to you, and what was your approach in its use in this book and your other work?
Whoa! So this is gonna be a real interview. Yeah, I mean the book is about language, and it's about resistance, but it's also about the acceptance of the language of home. And in Mississippi, you know, like a lot of rural southern places in the United States, a lot of times the language of Black Southerners is really always under surveillance, and it's always disciplined. And I wanted to create a book where the language actually was the primary character. Do you know what I'm saying? The language is the primary character in the book, which means that place and mores and power are necessarily like always contending with each other. So I wanted to do that, but I wanted to do it in a way that was sort of inviting for people, hopefully inviting for younger people. But yeah, language is the main character in that book to me.
I think that's kind of clear from the introduction, actually, and I think how you open it up upon reading it, you know, you kind of know this book is about language. You know, when you introduce the idea of the can you use that word in a sentence structure, and I think that on the first page was particularly important. I think as we'd like to kind of talk about Black Male Love in this interview a little bit later, what was kind of interesting to me, though, is that the character Lavanda Pila was the kind of first person mentioned in this book. And I think that, again, shows how language can kind of reaffirm and kind of position love in a way, you know, like this is as an ode almost.
One of the things for me was how you use language, but also how you use language to explore memory and reimagine at the same time. So I kind of wanted to find out the relationship with language and your use of time and time traveling and shifting between places, characters.
That's tough. Well, you know, language, at least the way language has been used in my home, is a form of time travel. You know, a lot of the sentences that I grew up listening to in my grandmother's home or in my grandmother's church or in the community, when you break it down, you would have, like, you know, anachronistic phrases mixing with like contemporary phrases, mixing with phrases that haven't even necessarily been accepted by anybody yet. And in some way, you can see certain sentences as embodying the past, present, and future, right? Right. And so what I wanted to do, I mean, so for me, like the apparatus of time travel in the entire book, like mimicked what I see as some sort of time travel within particular groups' uses of sentences and words. You know what I'm saying? But again, the key is to, like, how do you explore that without being too, you know, nerdy or weird, and so you know, I have people read the book and they say, do you know that the last sentence in the book doesn't have a period? And I'm and I'm like, yeah, you know, that's not a typo, right? That's kind of like an attempt to nudge the reader into understanding that beyond reading a tale of, like, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 young people from Mississippi, they've been reading a tale of the way language is policed, unleashed, and ultimately needed to, like, free us and liberate us, I believe.
And I'm so kind of pleased that you said that, because kind of to frame it in a way that's also relevant to the UK. A little while ago, in a school that's predominantly black, in an area that's predominantly black in London, a school head teacher said that basically the children were not allowed to use slang at all. Like, this school is banning this. So you can't use words like ain't, man, you know, oftentimes young people here start sentences with the phrase like. It's all banned. You're going to learn how to speak correctly. You're going to learn how to use the Queen's English as a way of empowerment. But almost kind of like, and I think this is reflected in long division, that also acts as a process of disenfranchisement and almost like an assault, you know, on these young people's identities.
Completely.
Yeah, and so I think really one of the things that stuck out in long division is that these people made sense almost of their realities through language. You know, like when City says, like, I'm not the best student in school, but I know how to use a sentence.
Right.
And so, like, I wanted to know, when did you kind of understand language as this tool of power or oppression, and how did that kind of form over the years for you?
I mean, for me, it's easy. You know, my mother, I had to read a lot of books, and my mother, you know, made me write a lot of essays about the books I read coming up. My mother's a teacher. And if I did not use what you call the Queen's English, what we call the King's English, if I didn't use it correctly, I literally would get beaten by my mother. And you know, initially I couldn't understand why she would try to beat me for not using the language, using this particular kind of language correctly. And then I just understood that she was trying to beat me to protect me, because in her mind, mastering the King's language was a way to move through this country. You know, in some way relatively unhampered, undisciplined. But when you start to think about that, you know, you have Black American parents, at least you had Black American parents, trying to prepare their kids for a society that would not just accept them, but would not accept their language. You know what I'm saying? And so like this book in some way is my writing directly into that, like the paradox of discipline. I mean, you have like these Black parents who were at once Black children who were disciplined for lack of proper English, even though nobody speaks proper English in the world.
Absolutely.
And so yeah, I wanted to write a book that kind of explored, like, you know, the terror and intimacy in at least Black American particularly use of language. So it's really cool to hear that the book might translate to some things that are happening across the pond, or whatever they call it. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It really, really, really does. And that's kind of why we want to talk about next. I'm a Londoner of Nigerian heritage.
Okay.
And I'm a semi-Londoner of Pakistani heritage.
So kind of like the London experience almost of minorities, or Black minority ethnics as we call it over here, is really one of very recent migration. And so one thing that your book really kind of felt to me is like you were imagining Blackness in a way that was very specific to the South, very specific to America, but really translated it to that diasporic reality as well. So I just want to know, what does Blackness mean to you?
Whoa. Man, y'all aren't playing. I mean, Blackness, that's a big question.
It is.
But Blackness, I don't know what Blackness doesn't mean to me. I mean, I guess I spent I spent kind of my whole life thinking about what Blackness means. Let me just go back for a second. One of the interesting things about that book is, you know, in that contest, can you use that word in a sentence contest? Initially, you know how he goes off on that Mexican young woman, and initially in the first 3 or 4 drafts of the book, that woman was a South Asian woman, an Indian young woman, and brother. But I remember my editor was like, nobody's gonna believe that. Nobody's gonna go for that. Nobody cares about the relationships between Black people and South Asians. And I was just like, really? Like, don't you think we should really like push that a bit more, particularly when you're talking about a sentence contest? And at least here, you know, kids of South Asian heritage do so well in like spelling bees, you know. So I was just trying to push on that. But it's so interesting. Like, my editors were like, no, you know, you need to really root it in and like the nation's conflicts and this idea that there's conflicts between Mexicans and black people. But to go back to your question, I mean, blackness just means I don't know what it doesn't mean. It means everything. I think the hard part for me is to consider a part of blackness that is not contested. You know what I'm saying? So even when I sometimes think about the most joyful black experiences, whether they be joyful diasporic black experiences or joyful black American experiences, in some way I still think that those joyful black experiences are, if not rooted, at least tinged with some form of resistance, which is wonderful, but also scares me because it makes me wonder, like, can blackness be non-reactionary? You know what I'm saying? I don't know. I don't know if it can or not. What do you think?
Well, to be honest, I think that's kind of like what ties it, really. And that's why maybe your text resonates in this context, because blackness, or even like the wider experience of minorities in this country, is very much shaped through one of resistance. And whilst particularly kind of we look to the US narrative, Hannah and I have been doing a lot of work really kind of retracing the actual history of South Asians and African and Caribbean migrants in this country and the resistance movement here, and how really in this country for a long time blackness was all encompassing. So for us, blackness wasn't just people of African descent. For a long time, blackness was,
about the 1990s, really.
Until the 1990s. And that was a specific political act, like, you know, to kind of break apart that blackness. But blackness here was all-encompassing for migrant communities, really. So
what happened in the 90s?
Well, late 80s, we had Margaret Thatcher, you had Reagan.
Right.
And she just basically tore it all apart through measures, through movement. And now, obviously, blackness here is synonymous with people of African descent. But initially, that's not what it meant.
I got you.
Let's talk now about another thing that really came up for us, which is about masculinity. And, you know, it's interesting because the other day we watched this talk with Melissa Harris Perry and Bell Hooks. And she,
I saw that.
Yeah, you saw it too. It was brilliant, wasn't it? And Bell Hooks had an interesting thing where she said, you know, we shouldn't see masculinity as negative, like just the actual word masculinity, you know. And sometimes I think we'd get tempted to do that as feminists. And she then kind of spoke about, and I think in this book, particularly through characters like the grandma and Shalaya, you know, you kind of identify woman and girlhood, like not as conduits for male actualization or realization, but women as individuals and humans on their own. But also I think through this character of City, you also demonstrate how masculinity doesn't have to be about an assault on women. And I think 80s City, particularly, you know, like the way he really just loves up on Shalaya is very, very, very interesting. So we just kind of wanted you to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested in exploring actually the way masculinity and femininity, I think, meet in human being on Earth, actually. And I wanted to create a text that forced young people of color, young black folks, to really reckon with like the really thin lines between fear, intimacy, sex, and love. And I feel like you can't really reckon with any of those without thinking about the way masculinity and femininity are like torn and tossed around in there. For example, I grew up with my mother, my grandmother, and my aunts, and if I were to talk about the way they performed themselves, I sometimes I don't know whether that performance was a masculine performance or feminine performance. You know what I mean? Like I'm not sure. You know, my family is really, really loud, and they love to laugh, and if you confront one of us, all of us are gonna step to you. We've been taught that that's masculine, but I've saw that embodied in all black women. You know, so in some way, I don't want to give that over to masculinity. I don't want to give that kind of like desire to protect the family over to masculinity. One, because I've never actually seen it in real men and just in my life. I wanted to create some, I mean, really, I just wanted to create like queer characters. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily I don't know that the cities want to have sex with. I don't know that 2013 City wants to necessarily have sex with Lavander, but I know he feels something weird sexually
Yeah.
from Lavander, right? And so I think so. I think we so often get stuck on whether or not this means you're blank or you're blank or you're blank. And what I wanted to explore was like what that meant in terms of is there any sort of like salient political act in establishing yourself as a loving human being who feels love and sexual urges from everybody on earth, even though you might not want to consummate those urges with other people. And I think that that's a question we should ask of young people, because the older we get, I think the harder it is to reckon with.
I think leading on from that, Rakaya and I have sort of spoken at length about one of the things that we found really refreshing in the book is the agency that you give to adolescent and teenagers that is often doesn't exist. And I think that also complicates the gender narrative and sexuality and makes room for characters to explore desire on different levels. So we wanted to kind of, find out more about why you wanted to write a book about teenagers. And what does that mean? How does that, translate into exploring blackness, into exploring sexuality, into exploring class?
Well, here I think we rarely speak to teenagers, particularly we rarely speak to black Southern rural teenagers. And when we do speak to black Southern rural teenagers, we're trying to convince them to buy something they shouldn't buy, like, McDonald's or Coke products or and hip hop. So now you have a lot of MCs that are actually like older than me, even trying to sell a particular kind of antiquated masculinity and femininity to 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. So in some way, I wanted to create a book that was like an intervention, and so you have like these 35, 40, 45-year-old men, white men and black men selling teenagers these narratives that are irresponsible, unloving, and really not dynamic. And I want it to be like I want to sell them something else. I want to sell that same demographic something else. But I didn't want to sell it to them in a disciplining way. I didn't want to be like, this is how you should be. I wanted to sell like this is actually who we were. This is maybe who you are, and this is possibly who we could be. And I just think you don't see that much when people are selling product to like teenagers in this country. So it was an intentional. I really believe that if you talk to teenagers and you affect teenagers, you can affect the world and the culture, and that's what hip hop has done. Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
Tell me, when you all say radical, tell me what you mean.
So I think people who have for me, radical means folk who have the audacity to envision this world in a way that it is not right now.
I love that.
That is basically how we...
So we're not kind of like, we're left wing or right wing or socialist.
The only thing we stick to is our
feminist. So we're just straight unadulterated feminists.
Right.
But aside from that, we're just radical. And kind of like as a lead on from that, I think that's why the book was particularly important to us, because Hannah's a writer. I was kind of involved in organising and like community organising for a while, and we realised that in a sense, even though we can expand and kind of have subversive acts of resistance, oftentimes it is through organising and writing and imagining ourselves and reframing our narratives as people of colour
that give agency to humanity.
Yeah,
kind of what you were saying, that these often the narratives that are told about us and at us are entirely devoid of our human experiences. So how do we envision being brown or black, South Asian, someone of African descent, African American? How do we envision these things outside of what is constantly told that we are? So I think for us that's been the core of it, and that is one of the reasons why I fell in love with your book, because I was like, wow, not just how you use language, but the characters you create, it gives room for that humanity. But I want to ask a really candid question. That you've spoken about this book was, created for an audience that people told you wouldn't read it, wouldn't sell. And you created for a group of people who don't necessarily read, but play, their experiences are blues and hip hop, and that's how storytelling is for them. How has that audience responded?
That's a good question. Well, okay, can I say that, when I think about audience, I think about folks who haven't been written to, and folks who don't read. I think about them often on the front row of my audience, but I am aware that there's a lot more people in the audience, right? So I'm also, I wrote this book to Toni Morrison, and she reads a lot, and I wrote I wrote this book to a lot of folks, but the people, okay, the thing that makes me feel the best as a writer, so you asked a candid question, I'm gonna give like a vain answer. The stuff that makes me feel the best is like when people come up to me and say, I never read a book before. You know what I'm saying? Like I've been at readings in Chicago, in Oakland, and in Mississippi, where people have come, where younger people and some older people have been like, that's the first book I finished. And I think that's a big deal because
Absolutely.
this is a tough book to read, actually, I think. You know what I'm saying? I think the metafictional stuff, I think the movements in time, I think there's a ton of characters you have to remember. And so for somebody to be like, that's the first book that I read beginning to end, it just makes me feel like, damn, at least in some small way I did what I wanted to. And then the flip is that when writers or artists or activists or journalists who inspired this book come to me out of the blue and they're like, yo, that shit was crazy, man. And I'm like, what? Like, you like that? And I was like, did you see your influence on page, 75 and stuff like that? So, yeah. So the influence, and my grandmother and my aunt and them, they don't really think I should be telling the world my business. You know what I'm saying? Like they're like well, in terms of language, to go back to our initial question, they don't think I should cuss in public. They don't think I should write cuss words in what I write, and they don't think I should let people into my heart when I'm writing. So for the longest, I tried to keep my work away from them, but they would always get it in a way, and they rarely ever said anything. They rarely acknowledged that anything in the book moved them. But with this one, my aunt read both in like 2 or 3 days, and she loved them, and that meant a lot to me because she inspired so much of it. She's a singer and she's a preacher, and all that said, I still know that there are a lot of folks who I hope to write to who won't, even if they picked up the book, they would stop at page 1, and also I wrote a book that I wanted to be taught. I wanted it to be read in private, but I also wanted it to be taught by really competent, soulful teachers. But that's just a wish, you know what I'm saying? So
we've already got, this morning we were discussing our syllabus, imaginary syllabus, and we started our course with Nas's Illmatic, and then we're going to teach you in the summer. So we kind of did a whole series alongside Kendrick, alongside Rachel Ganache. Like, we're just really... We've got
that's my girl.
Yeah, we've got a whole load in our...
Have y'all talked about
No, not yet. We're hoping to one day. So yeah, but this is really a book that should be taught. I think it affords young people agency, and I think that's particularly important. And to kind of go from there, I think mentioning those names, I think it's an interesting time in black art, in the sense that oftentimes we're told it's in the dying, decaying state. But 2013, 2012 was crazy exciting. You had yourself, you had Rachel Ganache, you had Ava DuVernay, you had what's that brother that did Fruitvale Station, Ryan Coogler. Yeah. And it was just like this whole kind of uprising of black artistry. And so I kind of want to know, what does it mean to you in this contemporary time to be amongst those kinds of peers and influenced by them, and black art and the state of black art at the moment as well?
I just feel, it's just the tip. It's about to get crazy up in here. You know what I'm saying? Like, Dear White Folk, that movie Dear White People is about to come out. I know about 4 or 5 books that are about to come out in the next few months that are just going to shake up the landscape. I think what I really believe is, I was talking about this last night, I think when they created that internet, I think they fucked up because I just think it allowed us it allowed people who were working in these like singular isolated places to actually like find community. And I think community is actually what creates a Fruitville station. What community definitely is what creates Good Kid, Mad City, and community is what helped create like this book. Rachel's work is filled with that kind of community. And so I just think that the art y'all about that we about to create, not just see, but create and consume in the next kind of forever is just about to be daring. And these corporations now can't dictate as much. I mean, they dictate, but they can't solely dictate like um our taste, right? Because they see that they see that there's an audience for our shit on our terms, and so then of course they want to jump in now and like make money off of that. But I think you see a lot of different people giving them the stiff arm, being like, no, you know, like I don't need your money because I know with your money comes your influence. And I just think this is a great time to be a black and brown artist. And I just feel good. I just feel good about the people working right now. And I'm glad that like I can be like consuming their art, but also working with them.
So I want to ask you a question about imagination and the importance of imagination to you. Just for a bit of background, the reason I write this is a really important Pan-Africanist, a contemporary Pan-Africanist. I don't know if you heard of him. His name is Biamvanga Wainaina, and he is Kenyan. And he's just come out to say, I'm gay, basically. But he did it in a way of critiquing the current kind of evangelical dominance in Africa at the moment, and a way that is almost hindering imagination and thus creativity and thus kind of viable resistance movements to the kind of decay of our political system. And Hannah was saying the same thing is happening in Pakistan at the moment with regards to like the influence of the Taliban. So I wanted to kind of ask you about imagination and kind of like religion. How does that kind of fit into it? Because in the book, the church is still there, right? And obviously when it is in the spirit, it almost feels, you imagine that, you made it a very kind of photographic scene.
I think that's really tough because you know, at least in my life, the church was at once this kind of institution that limited imagination, but it also provided a springboard for particular kinds of imagination. So, you know, within the church and within the church folks, I never heard people explicitly reckon with sexuality or sexual orientation, right? Never, which meant like, you know, a huge part of the imagination is just being mashed, right? Like you can't talk about it. And at the same time, I saw people use that religious landscape to create these like joyous, rebellious, communal hymns and songs, right? Which and a lot of the people singing those songs happen to be queer people, you know, and you knew it, but you didn't talk about it. So it's I think that to me is like the paradox of religion, at least in the Black South, is that, you know, we know there are a lot of queer folks in church. We know there are a lot of like gay men and gay and lesbians in the church, and we never reckon with that. We never talk about that. But at the same time, those queer women and men often needed each other and found joy in each other through the creation of art, through the creation of singing. You know what I'm saying? So it's that's what I was trying to show in that book too. You know, that the preacher says some terrible things, and the preacher in some way is like a caricature and he's a cartoon, but at the same time there's like resistance movement and resistance art being created in that space, and some of that resistance art fortifies those people, even though that same institution doesn't allow those people to talk to each other honestly. So it's just not black, it's not clear cut to me.
So we thought we'd move on now to talk a bit about your essays. So we, at the top of the new year, read your most recent essay on unreasonable love. And so we just want to kind of hand the floor over to you to expound a little bit more on what unreasonable love is.
Well, I wouldn't even call that. Can I say some things about that first?
Yeah.
So my friend Kiese Laymon she's an editor at Color Lines, and she asked me to if I would write like a little 800-word piece about Trayvon Martin. I don't write short pieces. I usually write long form essays, and so I wrote this piece and it ended up being like 3,000 words, and it was kind of like it moved a lot. And then she was just like, I didn't ask for all of that. I just want like something real simple. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna try to write a song in the form of a short essay. And so I think about that piece as more like a hymn than an essay. Um, and to me, it's just like it's real. It's like probably the simplest shit I've ever written. It's just, you know, I asked my students this semester, like, how do you want to be loved, and none of them could answer that question. And then I thought, well, I need to try to answer it. And I mean, I just realized I need to be loved and want to be loved, like unreasonably. And I thought about that particularly because of our history in this country, your history in your country. And I think people hold us to this like reasonable, people want us to be reasonable when people have been like so unreasonably destructive to us, right? And so the response is you should be reasonable. And I just think like at this day and age we need much more unreasonable art. We need art that goes outside the confines of what people tell us good art should do. We need interviews that like this one that ask like tough, unreasonably tough questions. But like that's how you get to the unreasonable truth. And it's simple. It's a real simple essay. I just think that sadly, like loving yourself as a black or brown person in this world, really loving yourself is unreasonable. Nobody wants us to love ourselves. And if they do, they want us to love on their terms, which is like a reasonable love. But they've already shown us that a reasonable love for ourselves means like an infatuation with like their norm. You know what I'm saying? So like you have to break it by being unreasonable. And that's one of the only reasons I'm here today is because people were unreasonable in organizing, unreasonable in loving, unreasonable in creating. Not massive groups, like small groups of like really concentrated, caring, loving, smart folks. You know what I'm saying? And so like if we're gonna get better, I think we have to be unreasonable. All those artists you named earlier, Ava, Rachel, Ryan, like those people made unreasonable art. You know? So that's where it came from. But it's not I don't think it's a good essay, and I think it's a real simple essay, but it's just one that I feel like I needed to write.
Well, we really appreciated it at the reading at the top of the year, and we really appreciated being able to talk with you today. Thank you once again, Kiese Laymon, author of Long Division, for talking with Hannah and I. And this has been a Ceasefire interview. Thank you. We hope you enjoyed.
Thank you.